Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Well, Mama don't allow no modern houses going on. Mama don't allow no modern houses going on. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna love my modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no modern houses going on.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio. Join George Smart and Frank King as they talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Support the show by going to patreon.com/US Modernist Radio for all kinds of fun incentives to shamelessly empty your wallet. Today, US Modernist Radio welcomes architecture critic Paul Goldberger and Cherry and Marsha Gordon, owners of Raleigh's most famous house of 2014. And now, your host of the podcast with more cost overruns than Calatrava, George Smart and Frank King.
Hey, welcome to the show. I'm George Smart. US Modernist Radio is underwritten by modboxusa.com. Turn your mailbox into a modbox with one of Modbox USA's colorful, stylish, retro, mid-century modern mailboxes that complements your home's modern aesthetic and turns mail time into party time. See one now at modboxusa.com. And by Sarah Sonk. When it's time to sell your modernist home, listing on MLS alone isn't enough. Reach out to an agent who loves modernist houses with the expertise, experience, and track record to close your deal. She's Sarah Sonk, 919-601-7339. On our iTunes site, there's a place for you to leave comments about the show. You'll see 2 very nice comments there now, which could be added to. And you can reach us at comments@usmodernistradio.org or follow us at Twitter at US Modernist. And now here's Frank with the Modernist News.
Good afternoon, everybody. According to a new Wall Street Journal report, the struggles of tackling IKEA as a couple are so real that one psychologist started using the retailer's furniture as a tool for improving couples' communication. The psychologist now incorporates IKEA products in communications exercises, tasking the couples with putting together a large piece of furniture at home and reporting back how it went. She tells the Wall Street Journal that a small coffee table is fairly undemanding, but it's the massive wall units like the $1,200 TV storage combo that holds the title of, get this, the divorce maker. Here's a quote from Courtney Frappier. She says, I'm convinced that IKEA is Swedish for pissed off boyfriend. She's a New York City publicist whose recent trip to IKEA with boyfriend Alex Melee ended in tears. The pair, both 26, was furnishing his new one-bedroom apartment with an eye toward Mrs. Frappier moving in later this year. But while they were walking through IKEA picking out items, Mr. Melee recalls thinking, oh man, she's going to take over and I'm going to lose all control of my place. Ms. Frappier says she saw the meltdown coming but couldn't stop it. Once we were in the store, she said, the reality of combining 2 individual lives started to sink in. That was 3 months ago. Good news, they're still together and so is the furniture they bought, but instead of calling the pieces by their official names, Mr. Melee just refers to them as terrible and misery. I'm never going back there, he says. You're probably wondering what saved the relationship. It's 2 words you won't ever see in an IKEA catalog, man cave. Dateline Tokyo. Narita International Airport Terminal 3 is exclusively for LCC, that's low-cost carriers. They focused on creating a completely low-cost airport with architecture and design. The budget for constructing the terminal was approximately half of the usual amount. To cut costs, they opted not to install the typical moving walkways. Oops. Instead, to offer, and I love this, an exciting walking experience. Oh, yeah. That is easy on the feet. They implemented running tracks used for track and field and added signage for user-friendly guidance. The designers say when time arrives for the 2020 Olympics in Tokyo, we look forward to seeing people from all around the world having fun walking on these tracks. Apparently, these guys have never actually been to an airport. And because there will be no moving sidewalks, I'm guessing the folks having fun will also be stepping over the collapsed bodies of other exhausted travelers. Something of a low-hurdle Olympic event. And Dateline Havana. With the historic lifting of the Cuban embargo creating an instant rush to visit the long-cloistered island nation, a rush for rediscovery will bring all manner of Cuban art, culture, and design to the fore. While it's not always acknowledged as such, Cuban architecture, especially modernist buildings, showcase an eclectic and exciting blend of styles, from the Spanish and Art Deco buildings that preceded them to the modernist and brutalist influence that came during the post-war period, including Paladar Vista Mar. Located in Miramar, this residence-turned-restaurant was once the home of architect Miguel Gaston, and showcases his affinity for the ocean. The signature feature, a stylish infinity pool that appears to literally spill into the sea. The effect of the pool spilling into the sea is so realistic that last year 2 guys launched inner tubes in the pool trying to get to Florida. Thank you.
Okay. Our guests today are Paul Goldberger. Paul entered Yale University undecided on becoming an architect or continuing as a journalist. While a freshman, his first submission to the New York Times was published as a cover story in the Times Magazine. 3 years later, Paul became the Times architecture critic, and in 1984, he won a Pulitzer Prize for distinguished criticism. He is author of several books, most recently Why Architecture Matters, which is how architecture affects us emotionally as well as providing shelter. Louis Cherry has been an architect since 1983, trained in literature at Duke University, art at East Carolina University, architecture at North Carolina State University, and banjo at Louis Cherry University. Louis is principal of a design build practice focusing on modern residential, commercial, and institutional design. He is learning by observation to make his mom's no-recipe, all-intuitive Thanksgiving gravy, and we'll find out more about that later. Louis is the husband of Marsha Gordon, Associate Professor of Film Studies at North Carolina State University. She is the author of Hollywood Ambitions, Celebrity in the Movie Age, and co-founder of the Bastard Film Encounter, which looks at films that are ill-conceived or received, or embarrassing or beyond the bounds of acceptability. In other words, much like this podcast. Welcome, guests.
Thank you,
Thank you.
George.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. So what brings these to our show today is North Carolina's most famous house of 2014, a house featured on the Today Show, the New York Times, the London Daily Mail, and Vanity Fair, among many hundreds of postings worldwide. Louis and Marsha began their married life with dreams of a modest, modern house in the Oakwood area of Raleigh, a long-established neighborhood in Raleigh, North Carolina. They bought an empty lot, and wanting to be a good neighbor, they started through the usual and arduous but necessary gauntlet of neighborhood and city approvals with great success. With signatures and completed forms in hand, they started construction, and then something happened that would change their lives forever and divided the quiet, stately Oakwood neighborhood. So, Louis and Marsha, what happened in the fall of 2013?
Well, we were approved through the Raleigh Historic Development Commission for got our certificate of appropriateness, got our building permit, started building, and then discovered that a neighbor had filed an appeal that appealed the approval, which is not normally what's appealed. Normally people appeal a denial. We really didn't, and were encouraged not to worry too much about it. Everything had been done properly. We had played by the rules, done everything appropriately, and bottom line, it got overturned by the Board of Adjustments, our approval, and our construction was halted, and we've had to go through a long legal process to reinstate our approval, which is now reinstated. We're living in the home, but through an arduous and really ridiculous path.
And let me make it clear that the Raleigh Board of Adjustment does not specialize in historic guidelines. They have no training in that area, whereas the RHDC, which granted our certificate of appropriateness, that is all that they do, is they look at historic districts and they do things like appeal. They do things like approve new construction projects as well as additions and renovations.
So this happened in the fall of 2013, and I think it was initially kicked off by the fact that your neighbor, Gail Wiesner, went before the city council to talk about opposition to the home.
That is certainly one of the things that she did. And we should point out that Miss Wiesner, although we live in an historic district, there has been new construction there. And Miss Wiesner's house was built in 2008. So hers is a recent house as well.
Okay. So we're going to hear a little bit from that testimony before the Raleigh City Council now. Here's a clip of Gail Wiesner in late 2013.
We've been able to preserve through about 40 years of scrupulous, agonizing COA processes where virtually every inch of every project that we proposed was measured and supervised. To all of a sudden, a rapid change, which caught us all off guard and knocked us in the side of the head, to anything goes, and we're going to allow types of architecture that have never been in there before, and it's primarily because we have a group of architects churned out from a very modernist school at North Carolina State that love modernist architecture. And architects like to do what architects are made for, which is to be creative, to show off their abilities. They don't like being stifled by the rules of restrictive covenants, not in our neighborhood or any neighborhood that has restrictive covenants.
As the case begins to build, people started to take sides. I mean, what happened in the neighborhood? This was not just a procedural difference. I mean, a lot of people got involved, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was a very emotional thing for understandable reasons. I mean, people who live in Oakwood really care about the neighborhood. It has gone through a lot. It went into decline like many neighborhoods next to downtowns did in the 1970s, and people fought hard to protect it and to preserve the historic fabric of the neighborhood. It is one of the most architecturally diverse neighborhoods in Raleigh, so it has homes that were built in the 1850s and 1870s and 1890s and 1920s and 1940s. And I think one of the things that happened is that people began to say, this is all old, this is all historic, it all looks the same, and you're building something new, when in fact that's just a kind of miscomprehension of the rich architectural diverse fabric of the neighborhood. And so everyone who has ever built in Oakwood has built a home of his or her time. And so it looked like it was built in the time it was built. And so there is no reason, there's no justifiable reason within the preservation community to create a false history. And so all Lewis was doing was trying to be very mindful in his design to create a home of its moment that was sympathetic to the character of the neighborhood.
So, Lewis, tell us about this house. Was this some wild titanium Frank Gehry thing that would just protrude into the neighborhood? I mean, what's the deal here? Why was she so upset? Tell us about the house itself.
Yeah, it's interesting because I really was striving for and believed that I had achieved a non-controversial design. I mean, it was designed to the letter of the guidelines, understanding that a house should conform in terms of its scale, its overall shape, its relationship to the street, its window patterns, etc., but that it should be reflective of contemporary technologies in terms of building construction, and it should be reflective of its time in terms of its design sensibilities. And I did all that, and our house is really based on a contemporary interpretation of craftsman homes, sort of valuing simplicity, expression of local materials, expression of structure. You know, it's a modern take on a traditional craftsman style house.
And it's modern. I mean, it's also very modest in its scale. It's a 2,100 square foot house on a small urban lot that's 50 by 100. And so, Lewis was very intentional in terms of wanting it to fit into the fabric of the community. It's not a very, very big house, nor is it a tiny house. It's a very appropriately scaled for where it is.
And it was really designed not as a look at me sort of a house. It's modest in its presentation. However, because it is different, many of the neighbors perceived it as a very bombastic, egotistical expression.
Threatening.
And threatening, yeah. And the word modern is really a lightning rod term that scares people to death.
Well, I noticed in one of the stories I read online that is her house directly across from your house?
It is.
Yep.
Is that the genesis of the? I mean, I know I heard her complain in another clip about an addition that was somewhat distant from her house on the edge of the neighborhood. But is the proximity part of the problem?
I'm not sure. It's hard to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously her proximity to it made her feel as if she had a horse in the race, as it were. But that has been an issue and a question all along. And the idea that an individual who doesn't like something can litigate to make it stop without any kind of legal justification has been a big issue here.
I want to ask Paul Goldberger, how typical is this, Paul, across communities in America to have this kind of reaction to a modern building?
Well, people do complain from time to time about modern buildings, about buildings they feel don't fit into particular neighborhoods, about things that they feel don't go with their surroundings. That's not that uncommon, and it's often quite understandable, in fact. What I've never heard of is a situation in which a building has gone through all of the proper approvals, where there was, in fact, a rigorous system of evaluating a building to determine whether it was appropriate for the historic district. The building actually got approved by the experts who were charged by the city with making that decision, and then the decision was overturned by a different board of appeals that had no connection whatsoever to that professional expertise that drove the decision in the first place. That was a complete wild card, and it's not something I've ever seen happen anywhere before, which is why I got very interested in this case when Lewis contacted me.
So you've seen the house and you've written about the house. What's your take on it?
Well, in fact, I'd say just about a year ago now that I was down there and met with Lewis and saw the house. It was during the period that construction had been put on hiatus, and there was even some degree of fear that in the worst possible outcome, they could be ordered to tear it down, in fact, which would have been really insane. I was amazed by the whole situation because the house struck me as being the most mild-mannered modern house I could imagine. I mean, it was a modern house that seemed to have bent over backwards to be a good neighbor. So I was and remain sort of a little mystified as to what the grounds for objection was there. It was clearly the only thing that house could be faulted on or faulted for was not looking exactly like Gail Wiesner's house and a couple of the other more recent but kind of pseudo-historical houses in the neighborhood. I was struck by two things when I went there to Oakwood. One was, as I've just said, that the house itself was extremely well-mannered and mild-mannered and discreet. It was as understated an example of modernism as you could ask for. The other thing that struck me was how diverse the neighborhood is, how this neighborhood is not a completely unified historical entity at all. It's, in fact, as I think Marsha said, is, in fact, what part of its appeal is that it's, in fact, rather diverse. And there's a range of different kinds of architectural styles from different periods in that neighborhood. And this house struck me as fitting right in and continuing the dialogue, the discourse of the neighborhood. The whole thing just struck me as almost otherworldly. I believe very much that buildings and architects and buildings need to pay attention to their surroundings, and nobody has the right to design in a vacuum, particularly not in a historic district or a residential neighborhood. But all of that said, the idea that the only way you fit in is to imitate, to mimic what's next to you, is ridiculous. That's like saying the only way we can all get along as a community is if we all look the same, dress the same, and speak the same. In fact, a vibrant neighborhood has a degree of architectural diversity just as it has a degree of human and social diversity. And this is the most well-behaved house I've ever seen that was, or I've ever heard of as being attacked for being something else.
So you saw the house, 2,100 square feet.
Yep.
No hot tub in the front yard. No overarching steel structure going into the street. In fact,
there
Louis,
you could have at least. I think, frankly, I could make a case if I wanted to for why a hot tub and on a suspended steel girder might be just the thing for the street. But putting that aside for the moment, there wasn't any of that stuff. This was as well-mannered a house as you will ever find.
We'll keep a note, Louis, for the expansion to put that in the plan.
Right.
But Louis, tell us about some of the specific features that you put into the house to match the neighborhood, because there were quite a few of those.
Well, there's a very important aspect of our circumstance that makes our house different, and that is the lot. It is one of two wide and shallow lots in Oakwood. The normal lot is very thin in its exposure to the street and very deep, and that makes for a house that has more frontage on the street than most. And perhaps if we were on that other lot shape, our house may not have been controversial. So that said, the house is of a similar height to the houses around it, and in Oakwood, it has a similar roof shape. It's a simple gable. It has a large, generous porch that faces the street. The windows are arrayed in patterns that relate to sort of, as I said, the inspiration of the craftsman home with groups of 3 and 2, and they're vertically proportioned. And so the palette is very similar. The thing that is different about it is it's much more abstract. There's really no details. The roof plane is articulated as a very simple plane. The walls are very planar. The bay window is a cube that projects. So it's an abstraction. And I think that's what people immediately understand, is that it doesn't have those details and it doesn't, express itself in that way. But the core of it and the compositional sort of treatment and the material treatment is actually very compatible.
And I think one of the things that happened that's really unfortunate is precisely this fear of modernism. What happened is people kept saying, this is a modernist house. I mean, it really is not modernist in any pure sense of the term, as Mr. Goldberger knows from having been there. And so people began to say, well, what if people start tearing houses down and putting, and we saw presentations in the community where people would put through Photoshop images of truly ultra-modernist glass and steel houses, and they would take a Victorian house out of Oakwood and put one of these houses there. And so it created this sense of fear, of change, of destruction, and people felt threatened. And it was really unfortunate because it was about certain people drumming up fears in the community, and that just doesn't allow for any kind of conversation and comprehension about what the house actually is.
Right, I agree. In a way, I mean, I know this analogy may stretch things a little bit, but the way that campaign proceeded, it almost seemed like the kind of things you used to hear about, racial change in neighborhoods and so forth. Imagine if these black faces were living across the street from you, and then suddenly everything would be like that, and we'd be ruined.
Right.
It sounded to me almost like the sort of subliminal tone here, which is just very bizarre. The idea that modern architecture, which had its origins, as we all know, in a kind of social and utopian view of society, would actually be portrayed as this evil thing destroying every value we hold dear, is itself pretty bizarre.
Well, there were some public meetings, and some of the opponents made exactly that case, that modernism, it was just a terrible, naive sort of presentation about modernism, but basically it was saying that modernism was all about the tabula rasa, and it was fundamentally committed to the destruction of the past and replacing the past with this bright new future.
Godzilla is on the coast and coming this way.
Yes, yes. No, you do hear that. I mean, look, we see that in a lot of other cases, too, the arguments against Frank Gehry's design for the Eisenhower Memorial in Washington, some of them have brought out similar arguments that this is all about chaos and destruction of American values, and Eisenhower stood for the preservation of American values. Therefore, this memorial is terrible. It's quite a leap, and I'm always very wary of attempts to tie architectural style to social and political values. It's an argument that never ends well. It seems to me it never brings you to a particularly good place. And it certainly didn't here.
Yeah, and I think part of it, too, is that idea that people look at a neighborhood like Oakwood, despite its diversity, and just see it all as old. And so, you know, as everyone here knows, the only thing that can make a house historic is the passage of time. You cannot build a new historic house. So time is the only thing that will allow, you know, a new home in an area of older homes to look old. And so, again, that was just an idea that was new, I think, to people in this community, and that caused some fear.
And the idea that in fact, you know, architecture is a way in which, Lewis Mumford put it best, actually, when he said, in a city, time becomes visible. I don't think it's ever been said more concisely and more beautifully and more powerfully than that. And this argument attempts to make time invisible by pretending that time doesn't exist. In fact, the beauty and the greatness of an urban neighborhood is seeing the layers of time. You know, Vincent Scully once defined architecture as a dialogue between the generations conducted over time. And that's precisely what Oakwood does, as so many cities do, and does very effectively. And this house, in my view, just adds to and enriches that dialogue, whereas others want to cut it off.
Yeah, and I got to tell you, I'm looking at a photograph of your street. You guys are standing out in the streets, and the Gales house is also very close, a lot of frontage, and very close to the street. And taking in both houses at the same moment, I don't see to the untrained eye a lot of difference in the two styles of architecture there. You know, it's not like you've got Gales house and then this big mansion on a quarter-acre lot. You know what I mean? You obviously took care with the windows. They look a great deal like Gale's windows, and I think it fits in nicely. Do you think it's just become a crusade with her? Perhaps she's gotten her teeth into it, and she just doesn't want to back down.
I don't know. You'd have to ask her. I don't want to presume to speak on her behalf. You know, all we can do now is just kind of proceed. We're living in the house. I mean, that's the good news is, you know, after our Superior Court victory, we were allowed to resume construction, and we got our CO. And, you know, we are living in the house and very, very happy to be there. Well,
and we would like to believe that we have been part of a conversation that has been helpful in helping people understand. In fact, I know in the Oakwood community, a lot of people have gotten a really good education about in a positive way about, you know, the value of diversity and to move forward. You know, how can this neighborhood live into the future and be a vibrant community, and to be part of the larger conversation about preservation and architecture and creating opportunities for architecture, because it's very difficult to build good buildings in any neighborhood, any community, and when you legislate architecture away, then it's impossible.
Yeah, and I think people do get somewhat accustomed to kind of builder home aesthetics and communities of sameness. And so I think this is also about understanding a different model for architecture and architectural evolution that is also very sympathetic to the idea of preservation. I mean, because Lewis and I think, are both, I don't want to speak for him either, but pretty ardent about our belief in preserving historic homes, particularly in this neighborhood that we now live in. We want to see them protected. And that is not incompatible with the idea of also wanting on empty lots such as ours, where, you know, there was not a home there, that you can build something of the moment. And it helps keep the neighborhood vibrant.
So, Paul,
yes.
In this situation around the country where a couple is looking to build a modern or modernist house in a neighborhood, what are some of the things that you see they should do in order to get their neighborhood to be more accepting? I mean, you've seen this happen, I'm sure, in lots of places.
Well, see, one of the other ironies of this whole story is that I think Lewis and Marsha did all the right things. And so it's hard to think of something that they didn't do that one should do.
Yes.
I mean, they looked very carefully at the existing architecture of the neighborhood. They tried very hard to fit in while not imitating directly, all of which is absolutely fine. They studied the historic district review process and then met with its approval. Not sure what else they could have done except investigate whether there were any rabid anti-modernists living across the street. But, not
be a
too
registry.
easy to turn that fact up. So, unfortunately, the luck of the draw was not with them in that way. But in every other way, I can't imagine what else they could possibly have done. Every neighborhood is different architecturally as well as it is different socially, politically, culturally, historically, and so forth. But in general, even the most historic neighborhoods do allow for a certain amount of new construction that varies. And in fact, we could even go farther and point out the Secretary of the Interior's guidelines for new construction in historic districts actually call for new buildings in historic districts to be more modern in design because they believe it's more important to sort of have time become visible, to use that phrase again, and not to create an illusion that everything happened all at one time when it didn't. I mean, for that, we can go to Disneyland. But a real town should have the visibility of time and the sense of layers of time being there. I just finished working on a book called Building with History that talks about some of the work of Norman Foster, the British architect who's one of the eminent practitioners in the world, who's built a sort of specialty out of building very modern additions to historic buildings and doing it in such a way as to strengthen the historic building and make it stronger, restore it, show that he's responsive to it and respecting it while never in any way imitating it and putting something modern next to it that creates a dialogue between the two. And he's done enough of those to now, as I said, fill a book. So this idea that the only way you respect what is there is by imitating it, I think is short-sighted and sadly simple-minded and limiting of what our neighborhoods and communities can be.
And Paul, just the Raleigh historic guidelines reference the National Park Service and actually echo that language exactly that you stated, that new construction should be different and should be expressive of the time in which it's built.
Right. So you were, once again, you were playing by all the rules. You were doing all the right things. So it's hard to know what you could possibly have done differently. Who can know when some crazy thing comes out of left field as it did in this case?
Well, but what's really interesting is that, going through this process and then getting so much media coverage over it, George, through the North Carolina Modernist Houses, started this legal defense fund that has helped us get through this. And through that website and people coming to that, we heard from people all over the country who either have gone through or are going through the same thing in California and in Texas and in Massachusetts. I mean, we could not believe how many people had, not the same story, but a kindred story. And so there's something happening in this country with regard to property rights and historic districts and people trying to, and not just in historic districts, it was not always that case. Sometimes it was just a neighbor trying to use litigation to stop something that they did not like. But so there's something in the air or in the water, I don't know, that is causing this to happen in a lot of other places and is really a very destructive very destructive force. I mean, we heard from people who had been really traumatized by their experiences, as were we. And
the response that was supportive of us was very much on the left and the right politically. I mean, this was an issue that appealed to all stripes when it comes to political persuasion. And I just saw today there's a bill before the Senate that would eliminate or prohibit the legislation of style in any restrictive covenants. So I think that's actually a backlash from our case.
Interesting.
I just saw that today.
We'll have to look that up.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the end game? When does this end for you guys?
It's in the Court of Appeals that Ms. Wiesner appealed the Superior Court's affirmation of our approvals. It's sort of in the middle of that process. Briefs have been filed, and it's probably 4 or 5 months from being resolved.
And just to be clear, we have our counsel, and the City of Raleigh has their counsel, and we are together with the City of Raleigh. So the City of Raleigh is also defending, our rights based on the process that we went through,
as well as their process.
Yes, and it was their process through the RHDC.
Yeah, that I think what I would find most frustrating is that you did everything by the book. You didn't try to cut corners. You didn't, and you didn't build it in the dark, wake up to find. And that's what would drive me around the bend, around the twist, is that I did everything by the book, and here we are.
I mean, it absolutely did. I mean, many a tearful night was spent going, why are we here? And, the expense, the financial expense, the emotional expense, I mean, the amount it cut into our working lives, I mean, we can't get any of that back. I mean, that's just gone. And, we just had to kind of, buck up. And we were so incredibly grateful for, the support of, the people who rallied behind us from the community, from the preservation community. Preservation North Carolina was incredibly supportive, from North Carolina Modernist houses, from people all over the country who helped us get through this, because it truly, I mean, we felt like we were just blindsided by a very strange process, and just were having to defend what did not seem like it was our business to defend.
And to be clear, the vast majority of the Oakwood community was very supportive of us.
Yes.
This was a very small minority, as is the case with many times these sorts of issues, a small, passionate minority. And we love the neighborhood, and it's great. It's not like it's a toxic environment.
Right. And, when the media gets a hold of a story, they like to paint it as, neighborhood versus individual. And it was never that clear cut from the start. So, yes, there have been some tensions, and, some of which, will be difficult to transcend. But, we love the neighborhood. We love its spirit. We love our neighbors. We have very, very close friends there. And so we're very happy to be there.
So, Paul, you're in New York, and another famous New Yorker weighed in on your case, Al Roker. How did that come about?
So Al Roker, how did that come about? We heard from the producers of the Today Show in the middle of all of this, and they asked if they could do a story. And so they sent someone up to do the story. And what was very interesting about that experience, that was our biggest television news exposure. And, we said no over and over again, because we didn't want this to turn into a tremendous circus, but we did feel it was important to share the story. And at the end of that segment, Al Roker made a comment about they gave these people a building permit. That should have been the end of the story, and that's true, and that really resonated with a lot of people. And that was kind of the most inexplicable part, is we had a building permit in hand, and we're doing what we paid it to let us do, which is build our house.
And you love it.
And we love it.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
It is a fantastic house.
It's amazing. It's
a beautiful house, and it's just I still find myself mystified as to what is supposed to be so objectionable about that house. I mean, I can see that certain kinds of houses might instill this, however rightly or wrongly, But this one, I cannot understand what, except for its failure to look like Disneyland, it can be faulted for.
Well, and I think that's precisely it.
So, Louis, one mystery we have to solve today is your quest to find your mother's gravy recipe, noted for its Thanksgiving audiences worldwide that seemed very pleased by this. How far along have you come with this?
I'm there.
You there?
Yeah. I mean,
can you replicate it exactly?
Sure. Well, my mother's still alive and well, and so she's still there to coach me. But Walter Magazine approached me about they were doing a piece with avid home cooks and sort of their holiday traditions. And so my mom and I made the gravy together for the magazine and, you know, sort of talked about that, how that was part of our Thanksgiving tradition.
So this is like the movie Jiro Dreams of Sushi. You have learned from the master and you're ready to move on.
It's quite a Zen thing, actually, getting the roux, you know, properly browned.
Does it take you many months to learn the basics of that, and then you move on to the substance of it?
Oh, years.
Years.
It takes years, yeah.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Paul, for being on the show.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good luck as this continues. I'm amazed that you guys still are not yet through the woods here.
We're almost there.
It is amazing.
I do have a question for Paul, actually, if I may.
Sure.
Yeah, Paul, I believe you're working on a biography of Frank Gehry. Is that correct?
I am. Yes. Speaking of architects who are not exactly designing traditional buildings. Yes, it'll be published this September by Knopf. It's just about finished.
And if I'm not mistaken, he's the only architect ever to be featured on The Simpsons, which I believe in my world is quite an achievement. Has he done anything else noteworthy besides being on The Simpsons? He
absolutely is. He was the subject of an entire episode in The Simpsons, and it was very funny, actually. It was a wonderful episode a few years ago. It's described in the book, and in fact, I just agreed to pay an outrageously high fee to 20th Century Fox for the rights to put one still from The Simpsons into the book. So it's fresh in my mind. Because we just agreed to their ransom demands.
Maybe one day our little house will end up on The Simpsons. That's when you know you've really made it.
Yeah,
yes, exactly. Well, you know, in fact, it would be a great story. It would be a great Simpsons plot, since they do seem to like architecture, and they satirize it brilliantly too.
You heard it here first. That means, Paul, they're going to have to pay you royalties if they want to do it. That's the good news.
Well, maybe there's a whole situation comedy that can be built around this.
Oh, actually. There is. It's a dark one, but
right.
Well, thank you all for being on the show. It's been great. Sure. It really is good to hear the story and to hear from you, Paul. US Modernist Radio is underwritten by Sarah Sonk, the real estate agent who loves modernist houses just as much as you do. 919-601-7339. And by modboxusa.com and their swanky, colorful, stylish, retro, mid-century modern mailboxes. Thanks for listening. I'm George Smart with Frank King. Take us out, Tom.
Visit US Modernist Radio on the web at usmodernistradio.org for links about people and buildings mentioned today on the show. US Modernist Radio is recorded at Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Meanwhile, follow us on Twitter at US Modernist or email us at comments@usmodernistradio.org. US Modernist Radio is a production of North Carolina Modernist Houses, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. Say that 3 times fast. I'm Tom Guild. George and Frank and I will be back in 2 weeks for another cantilevered, floor-to-ceiling, less is more, concrete and steel edition of US Modernist Radio.